The tray hit the marble floor before anyone saw it fall. Porcelain shattered across the entrance hall in a spray of white and gold, and the sound cracked through the assembled guests like a slap. Every head turned. In the center of the wreckage knelt a young woman in a plain grey dress, her hands already gathering shards of china with trembling fingers, her cheeks burning red beneath a spill of dark hair that had come loose from its pins. Above her stood a tall woman in emerald silk, her lip curled in open disgust. "Clumsy little nothing," she said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Someone ought to teach the help some manners before they're allowed near guests." Laughter rippled through the crowd of finely dressed visitors, quick and cruel, the kind of laughter that costs nothing to give and everything to receive. The young woman said not a single word. She only knelt there, gathering the broken pieces of porcelain into her apron, her spine straight even as her face burned, and something in the quiet dignity of that silence was more devastating than any protest could have been. Before the story goes further, if you find yourself moved by quiet strength in the face of cruelty, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight, because what happens to this overlooked young woman by the end of this story will stay with you long after the credits roll. Her name was Margaret Whitfield, though almost no one at Ashcombe Hall ever bothered to use it. 3 years earlier, Margaret had arrived at the great house as a girl of 17, brought along by her mother, who had taken the position of housekeeper after the death of Margaret's father, left them with nothing but debts and a single trunk of belongings. Ashcombe Hall was the kind of estate that swallowed people whole, its corridors stretching on for what felt like miles, its ceilings so high that voices echoed strangely, its gardens so vast that a person could walk for an hour and never reach the end of the hedges. Margaret's mother, Mrs. Whitfield, was a woman of quiet competence and fierce pride, and she ran the household with a precision that earned her the grudging respect of the staff, if never quite the warmth. Margaret herself was given small duties befitting the housekeeper's daughter, mending linens, arranging flowers, helping in the kitchens when the cook was overwhelmed, but she occupied a strange and uncomfortable space in the household's hierarchy. She was not quite a servant, since her mother held a position of some authority, and yet she was most certainly not a guest, not family, not anyone the visiting gentry needed to acknowledge with so much as a glance. She existed in the gaps between classes, seen by everyone, and truly noticed by no one at all. The family who owned Ashcombe Hall, the Earl of Ashcombe's distant cousins, who managed the estate in his long absence abroad, treated Margaret with the casual indifference one might show a piece of furniture that had been in the room so long it no longer registered as present. It was the guests who arrived for house parties and hunting weekends who proved crueler still, for they arrived with fresh eyes and fresh appetites for entertainment, and a housekeeper's daughter who dared to read books above her station, who dared to speak with more polish than her position warranted, made for an irresistible target. Chief among her tormentors was Lady Constance Ashwood, the daughter of a viscount and a frequent guest at the hall, whose beauty was celebrated everywhere she went, and whose cruelty was disguised so thoroughly beneath charm that few ever recognized it for what it was. Lady Constance had decided early on that Margaret's quiet manner and evident intelligence were an offence against the natural order, and she made it her particular pleasure to remind Margaret of her place at every possible opportunity, usually in front of an audience large enough to guarantee maximum humiliation. The drop tray in the entrance hall was not the first such incident, nor would it be the last. Margaret had learned over 3 long years that the only defence available to her was silence. To argue was to invite worse. To weep was to hand her tormentors exactly the victory they sought, and so she had built around herself a kind of composure that looked, to the careless observer, like coldness, but was in truth the only armor a powerless girl could fashion for herself. She swallowed her humiliation the way one swallows medicine, all at once, without tasting it, and she went on with her work because there was no other choice available to her. That evening, after the shattered porcelain had been swept away and the guests had retired to dress for dinner, Margaret slipped away to the one place in the great house that belonged entirely to her. The old library in the West Wing, rarely used by the family, its shelves heavy with books no one else seemed to want. She had discovered it in her first month at Ashcombe Hall, and had returned to it nearly every evening since, curling into the window seat with whatever volume caught her interest, losing herself in worlds where no one cared whether her dress was grey or gold. It was in small unwitnessed moments that Margaret's true character revealed itself, moments that mattered to no one who might have thought to reward them. She was the one who slipped an extra roll of bread to the youngest kitchen maid, a girl of 13, who cried at night for a home she'd been sent away from. She was the one who sat with old Mr. Pruitt, the estate's ancient gardener, when his hands shook too badly to hold a teacup, steadying his grip without a word of comment that might embarrass him. She was the one the stable boys came to when they'd torn a shirt or scraped a knee, because she never scolded and never told. None of this humanity registered with the family or their guests, who saw only a housekeeper's daughter with ideas above her station. But it was noticed quietly by those with eyes sharp enough to see past silk and title to the person underneath, and one such observer had only just begun to watch. The Earl of Ashcombe, James Farrington, had returned to his ancestral home after nearly 5 years abroad, years spent partly in diplomatic service and partly in a deliberate, self-imposed exile from a society that had wounded him more deeply than he ever let anyone see. He had been engaged once to a woman of great beauty and greater ambition, who had accepted his proposal with every appearance of devotion and abandoned him within the month for a wealthier prospect the moment his family's finances suffered a temporary setback. The betrayal had left him guarded in a way that no fortune could repair, suspicious of charm, distrustful of beauty offered too readily, and disinclined to believe that anyone's affection for him was separate from his title and his land. He had come home now because duty demanded it, not because he wished to resume the round of parties and courtships that had once nearly ruined him, and he moved through his own house parties like a man attending his own funeral, polite, distant, and entirely unmoved by the women paraded before him in hopes of catching his eye. He had noticed within his first week home that his distant cousins ran the household with a carelessness toward the staff that troubled him, though he said nothing of it, yet preferring to observe before he acted. It was on the evening of the shattered porcelain that the Earl first truly saw Margaret Whitfield, though he did not yet know her name. Restless and unable to sleep, he had wandered the West Wing long after the household had retired, seeking the quiet of the old library where he had spent so many hours as a boy. Out the door, already open, lamplight spilling into the corridor, and, when he stepped inside, he found a young woman curled into the window seat, a book open on her knees, entirely absorbed in its pages, unaware that she was observed. She had not dressed for the evening the way the guests had. Her hair was still coming loose from its pins, her plain grey dress marked faintly with the day's work, and yet there was something in the stillness of her posture, in the total absorption of her attention, that struck him more forcefully than any ballroom beauty had managed in years. He stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed him, and, when she did, she startled upright, the book nearly slipping from her hands, colour rushing to her face as she began to stammer an apology for trespassing in a room she had no right to claim. "You need not apologize," the Earl said quietly, stepping further into the room. "A library exists to be read in. It would be a poor use of shelves, otherwise. Margaret stared at him, uncertain whether this was kindness or a trap, for she had learned to expect the latter from those above her station. "I did not think anyone used this room, my lord," she said carefully, rising to leave, the book still clutched against her chest like a shield. "Please sit," he said, and something in his voice, low and without command, made her hesitate rather than flee. "What is it you're reading, that it could hold your attention so completely you did not hear me enter?" She showed him the Spine, a worn volume of poetry that had belonged to no one in particular for years, gathering dust until she had claimed it. They spoke only a few minutes that first night, of books and nothing more, and yet the Earl left the library with the strange, unsettling sense that he had encountered something rarer in that housekeeper's daughter than in any drawing-room full of eligible ladies he had endured that week. He began, after that, to watch her, though he told himself at first that his interest was merely curiosity, the idle fascination of a man starved for anything genuine after years surrounded by performance. He noticed the way she moved through the house, nearly invisible to everyone else, the way the guests spoke over her or through her, as though she were furniture, the particular venom Lady Constance reserved for her whenever an audience was present. He noticed, too, the small kindnesses Margaret performed when she believed no one of consequence was watching, and he began to understand that her silence, in the face of cruelty, was not weakness, but a kind of extraordinary control, the discipline of a person who had learned. He found himself returning to the library in the evenings, timing his own restlessness to match hers, and though their conversations remained brief and carefully proper, they became for both of them the truest hour of each day. Lady Constance, meanwhile, had begun to sense that her efforts to secure the Earl's attention were failing to produce the desired effect, and her frustration curdled quickly into suspicion. She noticed his distraction at dinner, the way his gaze occasionally drifted toward the housekeeper's daughter, clearing dishes at the edge of the room, and she resolved, with the particular determination of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, to eliminate whatever obstacles stood between herself and the title she had already begun to consider hers. She cornered Margaret in a service corridor the following afternoon, her voice dropping to a hiss that carried nonetheless. "I don't know what game you imagine you're playing," Lady Constance said, "but a housekeeper's daughter reaching above her station is a joke that ends badly for the girl who tells it. Remember what you are, or I will remind you myself, in front of everyone, until you never forget it again." Margaret said nothing, only lowered her eyes and continued on her way, but the threat settled into her chest like a stone, and that night she did not go to the library at all, afraid of what her presence there might cost her mother's position, the only security either of them had left in the world. The Earl noticed her absence immediately, and the following morning he made careful, deliberate inquiries, learning within a day precisely what had transpired in the service corridor. For the servants of Ashcombe Hall to adore Margaret Whitfield, and were only too willing to speak in her defence once they understood that the master of the house was listening. He learned, too, of older cruelties, humiliations, stretching back years, incidents his careless cousins had allowed to flourish, unchecked, in his long absence. Something hardened in him as the picture assembled itself, a slow-burning anger at the way his own house had permitted a decent young woman to be tormented for the crime of having nothing, while women like Lady Constance were fawned over for having everything except character. He did not confront Lady Constance directly, not yet, for he had learned in his diplomatic years that patience often accomplished what anger could not, and he began instead to watch more closely, waiting for the moment when the truth of every person under his roof would reveal itself beyond any possibility of denial. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected, on an evening when a sudden autumn storm trapped half the household indoors, and tempers, already frayed from days of forced proximity, began to fray further still. A young kitchen maid, hurrying through the drawing-room with a tray of refreshments, slipped on the polished floor and sent a pitcher of wine crashing across the hem of Lady Constance's gown. The reaction was immediate and vicious. Lady Constance rose from her chair with a cry of outrage, seizing the trembling girl by the wrist hard enough to bruise, her voice rising into a shriek of humiliation directed not merely at the accident, but at the girl's entire existence, calling her clumsy, stupid, unfit even for service, until the child was sobbing openly before the assembled guests. It was Margaret who crossed the room without hesitation, placing herself gently but firmly between Lady Constance and the frightened maid, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. "She meant no harm," Margaret said quietly. "A stain can be cleaned. Frightening a child cannot be undone so easily." The room went silent. No one had ever seen the housekeeper's daughter speak in her own defense, let alone in defense of another, and Lady Constance's face contorted with a fury that stripped away every layer of practiced charm she had cultivated for years, revealing, in front of witnesses she had not accounted for. The Earl had entered the room only moments before, unnoticed in the chaos. He watched the entire exchange unfold from the doorway, watched Margaret's quiet courage set against Lady Constance's naked viciousness, and understood, with a clarity that settled something long unsettled in his chest, exactly which of the two women possessed the character worthy of the life he had to offer. He said nothing that evening, allowing the moment to pass without public comment, but something in him had finally, fully decided, and from that night forward, his patience with the cruelties of his own household began visibly to thin. In the days that followed, the tension in Ashcombe Hall thickened like the air before a storm that has not yet broken. Lady Constance, humiliated by her own display, and increasingly desperate as she sensed the Earl's attention slipping from her grasp entirely, began to scheme in earnest, drawing the family's estate steward and two of her closest confidants among the guests, on whatever pretext could be manufactured. Margaret, unaware of the machinations gathering against her, continued her quiet work and her quiet kindnesses, sustained through the growing tension only by the stolen hours in the library, where the Earl's manner toward her had softened into something neither of them spoke aloud, a warmth neither wealth nor title had ever managed to summon in him before. It was Margaret herself, passing along the servants' corridor one evening with an armful of linens, who overheard the conspiracy taking shape behind a half-closed study door, Lady Constance's voice low and urgent as she instructed the steward on the false accusation of theft they intended to level against her. Timed to coincide with the grand autumn ball the family was hosting in a fortnight, an accusation designed not merely to see Margaret dismissed, but disgraced beyond any hope of future employment, punished thoroughly enough that she would trouble Lady Constance's ambitions no further. Margaret stood frozen in the corridor, the linens clutched to her chest, her blood running cold at the scale of the cruelty being planned against her, and, for the first time in 3 long years, her carefully maintained composure threatened to crack entirely. She did not go to the Earl with what she had heard, though every instinct urged her toward his door. She had spent too many years learning that the powerless, who complain against the powerful, are rarely believed, and rarer still are they protected, and she feared that any accusation she made against Lady Constance would be dismissed as the desperate fabrication of a servant grasping above her station. But the Earl was not so easily deceived as Lady Constance had gambled, for he too had ears in his own household, servants loyal enough to Margaret now that word of the whispered plot reached him within a single day, delivered by the same kitchen maid Margaret had once defended, who came to him trembling with the courage of gratitude finally repaid. The Earl listened to every detail in grave silence, and when the maid finished speaking, he thanked her with a gentleness that surprised her, then sat alone for a long while in his study, working through precisely how he intended to handle what was coming. For he understood that a private word of warning would accomplish nothing against a woman as determined as Lady Constance, and that only a public reckoning, delivered before the very audience she meant to use against Margaret, would end the matter for good. The night of the autumn ball arrived, draped in every extravagance Ashcombe Hall could offer. Chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, their light catching on crystal and silver, until the great hall shimmered like something out of a dream. Silk gowns in every jewel tone swept across the polished floor. Diamonds glittered at throats and wrists, and the air carried the mingled scent of hothouse flowers, roasted meats, and the particular perfume of old money, certain of its own permanence. Margaret had been given the evening's most menial duties, relegated to the edges of the grand hall, to assist with coats and refreshments, dressed in her plainest grey, invisible as always among the glittering crowd. She did not know that the Earl had spent the afternoon in quiet, deliberate preparation, nor that Lady Constance had chosen this very night, at the height of the celebration, to spring her manufactured accusation before the largest audience the estate had assembled in years. The accusation came just as the dancing reached its peak, when Lady Constance, resplendent in emerald silk and dripping with borrowed confidence, raised her voice loud enough to carry across the entire hall, declaring that a valuable brooch had gone missing from her chamber. Given access to every room in the house, was responsible for the theft. The music faltered and died. Dancers froze mid-turn. Every eye in the crowded hall swung toward Margaret, who stood utterly still near the coach room, the colour draining from her face as 3 years of quiet humiliation crystallized into this single, devastating public accusation. For theft against a peer's daughter was no small matter in the eyes of the law. The room stopped breathing. No one moved. Somewhere near the punch table, a servant dropped a tray, and the crash of glass seemed to echo through the frozen silence like the tolling of a bell. It was then that the Earl of Ashcombe crossed the hall, his steps unhurried, his expression carved from something colder and harder than anyone present had ever seen on his face before. He did not go to Lady Constance. He went instead to Margaret, positioning himself beside her with a deliberateness that the entire assembled crowd understood immediately as a declaration. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the silent hall without need of raising it at all. "The brooch in question," he said, "is not missing. It is in my possession, exactly where Lady Constance placed it herself 3 nights ago, in the false-bottomed drawer of her writing desk, after removing it from her own jewellery case for precisely this purpose. I have known of this scheme for 2 days. I allowed it to proceed only so that everyone in this room might witness in full exactly what kind of character conceives such cruelty against a woman who has never done her a single wrong." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several guests turned instinctively toward Lady Constance, whose face had gone the colour of chalk, her mouth opening and closing without sound, every trace of practised charm stripped away in an instant, leaving only naked panic behind. "I have spent 5 years abroad," the Earl continued, his voice gaining, if anything, a colder edge, "surrounded by people who valued my title above my character, and I returned home hoping to find better in my own house. Instead, I found a woman prepared to destroy an innocent life to secure a marriage she has no right to claim, and I found servants and gentry alike who allowed her cruelty to flourish for years because the woman she tormented had no title to protect her." That ends tonight." He turned then to face the assembled crowd more fully, his gaze sweeping across guests who had laughed at Margaret's humiliations for years without a single thought for their cost. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and every syllable landed like a formal pronouncement, "has shown more grace under cruelty than any woman I have encountered in society, in London or abroad. Her honesty, her kindness to those with no power to reward her for it, and her composure under attacks that would have broken lesser spirits, have earned her a respect this household has been too blind to offer her. I intend to correct that, beginning tonight and beginning permanently." The formal consequences followed swiftly, delivered in the same measured, legalistic tone the Earl had used throughout. Lady Constance was informed, before the full assembly, that she was no longer welcome at Ashcombe Hall, or at any estate under the Earl's influence, and that word of her scheme would precede her to every drawing-room in the county before the week was through, a social ruin far more thorough than any brooch could have inflicted upon Margaret. The steward who had conspired with her was dismissed from his position before the night ended, his years of service erased by a single act of complicity. The Earl's distant cousins, who had permitted years of casual cruelty toward the household staff, were quietly but firmly informed that their management of the estate in his absence had fallen well short of what he expected, and that changes would follow. The crowd, which only minutes before had watched Margaret's humiliation with idle curiosity, now watched her vindication with the same hungry fascination, whispers of astonishment replacing whispers of scorn, servants near the punch table dropping into small dawn. Spontaneous bows of respect that no one had ever offered the housekeeper's daughter before that night. Margaret stood through all of it in stunned, trembling silence, the years of swallowed humiliation finally breaking loose inside her chest in a wave she could barely contain, tears rising to her eyes, not from sorrow now, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of finally, publicly, being seen. The Earl turned to her once the pronouncements were finished, his voice dropping into something gentler, meant for her alone, though the whole hall could hear it. "I should have spoken sooner," he said quietly. "I was afraid that anything I offered you would be mistaken for pity, when what I feel for you has never once been pity." Margaret, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to speak without fear in front of an audience of her social betters. "I never wanted rescue, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I only ever wanted to be seen as myself." "Then let me be the first," he said, "of many who finally do." The weeks that followed unfolded with the swiftness of a story racing toward its rightful ending. Lady Constance's disgrace spread through the county exactly as the Earl had promised, her invitations withdrawn one by one until she retreated from society entirely, her ambitions for title and fortune reduced to ruin by the very scheme she had designed to destroy someone else. The steward found no position willing to take a reference so thoroughly tainted, and the Earl's cousins, humbled by the public airing of their negligence, departed the estate within the month to manage a smaller property, leaving Ashcombe Hall entirely in the Earl's own capable hands. Margaret's mother, Mrs. Whitfield, watched her daughter's transformation with a pride too large for words, for she had endured her own years of quiet indignity in service to a household that had never fully valued her, either, and she found in the Earl's public declaration a vindication of every sacrifice she had made to keep her daughter fed. The Earl courted Margaret openly now without concealment or apology, walking with her through the gardens she had once tended in service, sitting with her in the library that had first shown him who she truly was, and their conversations, once careful and constrained, blossomed into the easy, unguarded intimacy of two people who had each spent years believing themselves unworthy of being truly known. He learned of her father's death, of the debts that had forced her mother into service, of the small kindnesses Margaret had performed for years without ever expecting recognition. And each new detail only deepened his conviction that he had found, in the housekeeper's daughter, the world had overlooked for 3 long years. Precisely the character he had feared no longer existed in the circles he moved through. Their wedding, when it came the following spring, filled Ashcombe Hall with a joy the great estate had not witnessed in a generation, guests arriving not from mere social obligation, but from genuine affection, servants who had once watched Margaret suffer in silence, her mother seated in a place of honour rather than relegated to the edges of the celebration. Margaret wore that day not the plain grey of a housekeeper's daughter, but a gown the colour of morning light. And when she walked down the aisle of the estate's small chapel, every eye that turned toward her turned in admiration rather than scorn, a transformation so complete it seemed almost to erase the years of humiliation. Though Margaret herself never forgot them, carrying the memory of every small cruelty forward, not as a wound, but as a measure of how far she had travelled and how much she now understood about the true worth of quiet dignity in a world too quick to judge by appearances alone. Years later, when Ashcombe Hall had settled into the comfortable rhythms of a marriage built on genuine respect rather than performance, Margaret often returned to the old library in the West Wing, now restored to its former grandeur and filled with new volumes she had chosen herself. And she would sit in the same window seat where the Earl had first found her reading alone, watching her own children play across the lawns that had once seemed so vast and unwelcoming to a frightened 17-year-old girl with nothing but a single trunk of belongings to her name. She thought on those quiet afternoons of Lady Constance, whose ambitions had collapsed under the weight of her own cruelty, and she felt, to her own surprise, no bitterness at all, only a settled understanding of the story's deeper truth, one she would repeat to her own daughters in the years that followed, whenever they faced a world too quick to judge them by their circumstances rather than their character. True worth, she would tell them, is never determined by the room a person is permitted to enter, nor by the silk they wear or the title attached to their name, but by the quiet decisions made when no one of consequence is watching, and